I'm gonna start now. Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Kat. I'm a biologist here at Ventura Audubon Society. Welcome to our March program. If you can go ahead and mute yourselves, and then feel free to unmute yourselves if you need to ask a pertinent questions, but we can hold all questions until the end and you can write them in the chat box, and Sabrina, our wonderful program coordinator, will read them to Miss Amy Denton at the completion of her program. But for short little newsworthy, oh my God, admit people. There we go. It is the start of snowy plover season. Yay! We officially began yesterday, March 15th. And this begins our weekly monitoring program for Western snowy plovers on Ormond and Hollywood beaches. In May, when California leaf turns comes, we'll start their monitoring program. And what's really interesting about this season is we already have the first nest of the season in Santa Barbara at Coal Oil Point. So the first nest in our area has already gone down. So we're anxiously awaiting to see if Hollywood or Ormond gets the next one. You know, there's always a little bit of competition between the sites, but it's all good fun. And yes, our program will be recorded and available on YouTube later. Our second newsworthy highlight is our Raise the Roost fundraiser program. And I will share that information right now. So can everybody see my screen? Hopefully. So from April 2nd to April 4th, we are going to be hosting a fundraiser and silent auction to benefit the Shorebird Recovery Program. And basically, the funds are needed for the upcoming nesting season and will pay for nest monitoring, habitat protection, fencing, signage, trail cameras, and supply for our volunteer naturalist program, which is where we bring in community members to help the biologists at Ormond and Hollywood help with some of the outreach and education and day-to-day tasks that go on with our monitoring program. So it'll be really cool. We have just a few people highlighted from the community that have graciously donated artwork, gift certificates, items. If you want an amazing kayak tour, Santa Barbara Adventure Company. Are you interested in some whiskey? Green Bar Distillery, the oldest distillery in Los Angeles, donated some amazing products. BC Beer, some of the best in the county. And just generally an amazing event is going to happen. We have some speakers from around the world. Claire Greenwell is an ecologist from Western Australia, and she's going to be speaking about the secret life of fairy terns. And she's got a really interesting tidbit about a feral cat who actually destroyed her entire colony. All the eggs, all the nests, all the chicks, one cat destroyed it all. So it'll be a really interesting presentation. And then Faraz, we all know and love him. He's an amazing wildlife photographer and conservationist, and he's going to be talking about casual birding and how anybody anywhere at any time can get into birding, and how it's accessible and exhilarating for everybody to participate into. So this is just our fundraiser page, and you can access this from the VAS webpage. And then if you click here, it'll take you to the auction website, and you can actually see, you know, just some of the items that are going to be up for auction. They're not all there yet, but we have some amazing jewelry. Look at that tiny plover, super cute. Foxfine jewelry, some handmade glass bird feeders. Gracious professional wildlife photographer has donated Lightroom and a beginner bird photography class. So it'll just be a general, really amazing event. If you have any questions, feel free to email us on the website or at cat.whitehouse@venturaaudubon.org, and I'll put my email in the chat, but I'm going to hand it over to Sabrina now.
Hey everyone, I'm Sabrina, and I'm excited to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Amy Denton. Amy is originally from New York, where she received her PhD in botany from the University of Washington. From there, she became a National Science Foundation and Alfred Sloan postdoctoral fellow in molecular evolution at UC Riverside and faculty at the University of Alaska Fairbanks in the Department of Biology and Wildlife, and herbarium curator at the UAF Museum of the North. Dr. Denton uses comparative DNA sequences to study how climate and geology have influenced evolution and the distribution of Arctic and alpine plant populations and their genes. Decades of research have taken her around the world, but since 2003, Dr. Denton has been a biology professor at Channel Islands University. She also teaches lifelong learning courses on science history, flora and fauna of polar regions, evolutionary biology, and climate change. She's also on the board of directors for the Ojai Valley Defense Fund and an animal care volunteer and member of the education team at the Ojai Raptor Center. Tonight, Amy is going to bring us a special program that incorporates data from the National Audubon Society. She'll explain some of the causes of climate change and what our changing global climate means for the future of birds. So with that, I will mute myself and pass you over to Dr. Denton.
Sorry. There we go. Okay, you should be seeing my kid awake there. Okay, well, hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. In the introduction, I heard Sabrina mention that I am originally from New York, and I'm actually back there tonight to be with my mom. So I'm in New York now, and it's about to snow. And if it weren't dark, I would show you some nice New York birds. I saw my first northern cardinal today, which is always fun to see when I'm back here in New York. Anyway, let's get right to it. This talk is going to be a bit sciencey. I was asked by Bruce to talk about the sort of causes of climate change and the evidence for climate change, and then to talk about how it might affect birds both globally and locally. And so I have tried to squeeze in as many pictures of birds as possible, but there's probably more graphs than birds, and I apologize for that. Just a little background on how I got to birds. I didn't always do birds. I got my PhD in evolutionary biology in botany, and I studied plants, and I studied them at University of Washington. I had plant populations in the Cascades. I worked on rhododendrons. And then I got to go to Tibet several times and collect plants in the Himalayas. And I fell in love with alpine plants, because they have such a hard time surviving in so many wonderful adaptations. And so when I moved to Fairbanks, Alaska to be on the faculty, I found out that the plants there struggle even harder than plants growing at the top of Himalayan peaks because of the weather conditions there. And in 2001, I went on my first Arctic plant collection trip in Cape Krusenstern, which is north of Kotzebue, Alaska, so up there in the northwest corner of Alaska. And I just fell in love with Arctic plants. There were some birds there, they were kind of nice, but with plants, you can walk right up to them. You don't need binoculars. You can take their picture with a cheap cell phone. You don't need a long lens. And I'm really and truly a plant person. And then I discovered birds. And I want to thank really the person who turned me on to birds was this guy, Jim Wilson, who is an Irish naturalist and particularly an ornithologist. And I try to go to the Arctic every summer. I went to the Arctic in 2014. I was on in a place called Flatey in Iceland, and Jim was there doing a general bird walk. And then I heard this noise that sounded like a horse neighing. I had no idea what it was, and Jim pointed out that it was a common snipe. And when snipes dive, they vibrate their tail feathers and make this sound that once you hear it, you will never think of anything else. And to me, it's the sound of Iceland. And I realized then that birds aren't scary little flying dinosaurs. They're interesting. They have interesting behaviors and ecology. And quite frankly, as much as I love plants, they don't really behave. They just kind of grow there. And I began to love birds. And it really is because of the influence of one person who made me see how fascinating they are. So I really want to thank him, because I wouldn't be here without him. And you will notice, however, that because I learned about birds first from, Jim is Irish, and because I learned first about birds from somebody from the other side of the Atlantic, I know their other side of the Atlantic names. So when you hear me talking about Brunix guillemots, I really mean stick-billed murres, but I was taught that way, and it's hard for me to lose that habit. Second person I want to thank and is going to introduce this talk for me is Dr. Simone Aloisio, who started with me as a young professor at Channel Islands. way back in the early 2000s. And Simone was the first person, even back in 2003, who was talking about climate change. And he made it he's an atmospheric chemist, so he knew a lot about it. And he talked about it in all of his classes and really enlightened a lot of the faculty back then to the importance of climate change. And it's really quite remarkable. He was prescient because all of the predictions he made that we talked about in those early days are coming true. And so I wouldn't be here without him either. So that brings me to the talk. And the first part of the talk, I'm just going to give you a brief overview of climate change science. Because interestingly, you know, back in 2003 and 2004, when Simone was giving lectures to undergraduates about climate change, it really didn't register with a lot of people. And if you look now, this you know, past election year, when there were polls going around about, you know, what matters the most, is it the economy, is it healthcare? Finally, climate change is rising up there, and more people are becoming aware of it. And so I think it's important that everyone sort of understand just the basics of the science behind it. Certainly we're not going to do physics here today, but we're going to talk a little bit about it. So what is climate? Climate is just the average of precipitation and temperature, humidity and wind speed, and phenomena like frost and fog and hail and other things that occur in a particular region over long periods of time. And I mean, can be months, but usually climate is measured in years, decades. In fact, a common bit of time to measure climate is 30 years. So climate is different from weather. Weather is what's happening right now, what you observe right now in a short period of time. Climate are measurements of weather taken over a long period of time. So a way to think about that is maybe your mood today is like the weather. Your personality is like the climate. So what's climate change? Well, generally, climate change occurs just when those patterns in time or in space change. And we mean these patterns over long term, when we see noticeable changes over 5, 15, 20, 30 years. So for example, here's a picture, a 31-year composite average of the snowpack in the Sierra Nevada. And then when we see now, year after year, the snowpack much diminished, that's an example of noticeable and observable long-term change. So why should we be interested in climate? Well, climate is the determinant of the distribution of global plants, and therefore a very strong determinant of global animals. Climate determines where humans do things like agriculture and forestries and how we manage fisheries. Climate affects the types of soil we have. Climate affects the quantity of water and the quality of water that we can use for drinking and for agriculture and our other uses. And of course, climate determines the severity of extreme weather situations like droughts and storms and floods. But mostly because of its impact on plants and animals, climate affects where we see birds. Okay, so what determines climate? Well, obviously a lot of things do, but the two main components of climate are temperature and precipitation. And by far the main driver of both of those things is radiation coming in from the sun. Solar radiation powers Earth's climate. Other things like latitude and whether there are mountains, whether you're close to the ocean, all of those things are part of it. But the biggie is incoming solar radiation. And most of you have seen a picture like this somewhere. The sun's radiation goes through the atmosphere and down to the Earth. Much of it is absorbed by the Earth's surface and it warms the Earth's surface. And depending on where you are on the Earth, much of it bounces back. But what happens is that as it bounces back, gases in the Earth's atmosphere absorb some of this radiated heat from the Earth, and radiate it back toward the Earth. And so this is what is commonly called the greenhouse effect. And it is because heat that should be emitted back to space gets trapped in the atmosphere and radiated back to the Earth. And so the Earth's entire energy budget is just the balance of incoming solar radiation absorbed minus the outgoing radiation that's radiated back to space. And we call that, and unless that number is zero, unless the incoming equals the outgoing, then the Earth is either going to warm or cool. And in our case, it warms, and that warming is called radiative forcing. And so when we have positive radiative forcing, that means the Earth is warming. We're absorbing more than we push back out into space. So these gases in the atmosphere that are absorbing and re-radiating heat back to Earth, what are they? Well, you know most of them. There's water vapor. And in fact, water vapor is one of the most important greenhouse gases because it is responsible for radiating a huge amount of heat. We don't talk about it as much when we talk about climate change because it's short-lived. But anybody but you can see the effect of water vapor just living in Ventura County, right? If you live in Ojai, at night when the sky is clear and dry, most of that hot heat from the day gets radiated right back out to space. But if you drive down to Ventura, where there might be a cloud cover, it doesn't cool down nearly as much at night because that moisture in the air traps some of that heat. Also, that moisture in the air keeps some of it from coming down in the first place. So water vapor, an important greenhouse gas, but it doesn't stay in the atmosphere. It's very transient. These are the big three other greenhouse gases. Of course, carbon dioxide is the largest source of warming. Carbon dioxide has an amazing ability to absorb and re-radiate heat. And it's a fairly large part of our atmosphere relatively. Methane is another one. Methane is even better at absorbing and re-radiating heat, but we have a tiny amount in our atmosphere, although growing. And nitrous oxide is another one of these greenhouse gases. And some of the chlorofluorocarbons are also part of these, but in much smaller quantities. Okay, so how do we study climate change? And I often get this question because we've only been measuring carbon dioxide continuously since 1958, and that's been done at the observatory at Mauna Loa on Hawaii. We've only been able to get accurate temperature, measurements for a couple of hundred years. So how do we understand climate of the past? And the way we do that is we use something called a proxy. And so we all know what a proxy vote is, right? It's when one person votes in place of another. So we use proxy data. We use one kind of data that gives us an idea of temperature while not actually being a temperature measurement. And there are lots of ways to do this. We can look at pollen grains in the sediment. Pollen can last for tens of thousands of years in lake bed sediments. And so when we dig into the bottom of lake beds and find pollen that's 22,000 years old, we can identify pollen. You can usually identify to species or at least to genus from a pollen grain. So when you look at old pollen, you could say, okay, birches were living here 20,000 years ago. We know that birches can't tolerate temperatures above X or below Y, so we have a good idea of the temperature range. So we can get ideas from pollen. We can look at tree rings. In warm and wet years, trees make a lot more secondary xylem, so they have big fat tree rings. And in dry or cold years, trees leave scrawny little tree rings. Tree rings can also incorporate things like ash from volcanic eruptions and from high levels of pollution and so on. And then if we want to look deeper into time, and of course tree rings, the oldest tree rings only go back about 4,000 years. Pollen grains only go back 20, 30,000. So if we want to look deeper, we can look at things like coral reefs or particularly ice cores. And we can dig ice cores in glaciers. And we can also dig cores into seabeds. And in both of these cores, what we're looking at the trapped gases, particularly in ice. when you look at ice, you look at the gases that were put into that ice when it froze. And if you dig deep enough and get to very, very old ice, you can go back 600,000 years. And what we do is we look at the ratio of oxygen isotopes. We can look at oxygen with 18 neutrons or oxygen with 16 neutrons. And those two different oxygen isotopes will evaporate and condense at different temperatures. And so by looking at any given point in an ice core, we can measure the ratio of oxygen isotopes and estimate what the temperature was when that ice froze. So we can get a pretty good idea of past temperatures from ice cores. It's pretty amazing. So what's the evidence for climate change? Well, if we look at temperatures over the past, since 1880, when we've been able to measure temperatures scientifically, we can see that, of course, there are lots of fluctuations, but temperature has been increasing steadily. The Earth's average surface temperature has risen over 2 degrees Fahrenheit since 1880, and most of that warming has occurred in the past 40 years. And 2016 and 2020 were tied for the warmest years on record. So we see a sharp recent increase in temperature. And if you think that 2 degrees Fahrenheit doesn't seem like much, I want to remind you, here's a picture of the Earth 20,000 years ago at the last glacial maximum, when the place where I was standing in my mother's kitchen was covered by 3,000 feet of ice. And temperatures back then at the last glacial maximum, when North America looked like this, they were only 5 to 9 degrees Fahrenheit cooler than they are now. So a few degrees temperature really does make a difference. More evidence for climate change. The ocean is warming. The top 328 feet, about 100 meters of ocean, have warmed close to 1 degree Fahrenheit since 1969. Now that doesn't sound like a lot either, but think of the amazing energy absorptive capacity of the ocean. The ocean can absorb a huge amount of heat. And these warming figures, I gave you the warming figure for the top 100 meters, but they can measure it down to 2,000 meters. And it's even more. The deep ocean is warming and holding heat as well. And again, it's not so much the raw numbers, but it's the fact that those numbers have climbed rapidly. More evidence for climate change. Ice. Ice sheets, the largest deposits of continuous ice in the world, are declining rapidly. The places that are measured are Antarctica and the Greenland ice sheet. And NASA data shows that Greenland has lost an average of 278 billion tons of ice per year in the last 18 years, while Antarctica has lost about 150 billion tons of ice per year. And that rate in Antarctica has really sped up. It's tripled in the last decade. That's huge. More evidence for climate change. Arctic sea ice. Arctic sea ice will come back in our discussion of birds later. Arctic sea ice is declining massively, and you've all seen pictures of this. It's declining at a rate of about 13.1% per decade relative to that 30-year average between 1981 and 2010. And in addition to the extent of the sea ice, how far it covers from the pole down has also, the extent has decreased, and so has the thickness. The ice is thinner and more fragile. And again, these are real data. And I've sourced these all for you so you can go back and check if you'd like. Many of you have seen this picture. This is the most recent graphic made from satellite data that I could find. And if you look at September is the time of year when the sea ice is at its lowest at the end of a long, hot northern summer. And you can see with your eyes how much the visible ice pack has declined year to year. And of course, there are seasonal variations. The lowest ice year was actually 2012, but 2013, 2015, 2016, 2018, 2019, and 2020 are all almost as low. More evidence for climate change. Global sea level has risen about 8 inches in the last century. And so that seems like not so much, but the rate in the past 2 decades is almost double the previous 100 years. So again, it's not just that sea level is rising, but it's accelerating. This is based on USGS models that you can find online, and you can model potential sea level rise and lake level rise at a variety of places on Earth. So here is what models now show San Francisco Bay looking like in 2100, and at the beginning of the next century, if climate levels continue the way they are. And again, there's quite a bit of real estate here that is in the water. And as you know, some of this area is an important place for birds. And then finally, some last bit of evidence for climate change. And this, I think, is the one that really hits people: extreme weather. There have been a record number of high temperature events in the United States. If any of you remember, last September in Ojai, we had a day that was 121 degrees. The record lows have been decreasing, but even there are anomalies, right? We all just remembered a couple of weeks ago, there was those extreme cold temperatures that reached down into Texas and Mississippi. But on average, we're having many, many more record highs and fewer record lows. So seeing an increase in extreme rainfall events, in hurricanes, and of course in Southern California, fire. And many of you might recognize this as the Thomas Fire in 2017. Last bit of evidence for climate change is ocean acidification. The ocean absorbs carbon dioxide, and when carbon dioxide dissolves in the ocean, it makes carbonic acid. So the ocean becomes more acidic as it dissolves atmospheric carbon dioxide. And since the Industrial Revolution, the acidity of the surface ocean has increased by about 30%. And the amount of CO2 absorbed by the upper layer of the ocean is increasing by 2 billion tons per year. And acidified oceans have serious impacts to the things that live in the ocean. Carbonic acid inhibits the laying down of calcareous shells. So shelled organisms are making shells that are weak and cracked and damaged. So this is a healthy shell. This is a shell that developed under acid conditions, and you can see all these striations and cracks. So that affects mollusks, that affects shelled plankton, again, things that birds need. Okay, so hopefully I've provided some evidence, and at the end I'll give you some resources to look at more evidence for yourself. But we see evidence of climate change, but those are just measurements. What's the link between carbon dioxide and climate change? How do we know that those things are connected? Well, we can look at the levels of CO2 in the atmosphere before the Industrial Revolution, long before the Industrial Revolution, and since. And up until 1750, carbon dioxide levels were about 280 parts per million. And this has been confirmed by many different groups, including proxy data that goes back 500,000 years. The most recent reading for January 2021 is about 415 parts per million, up from a pretty stable average of 280 parts per million. Now, of course, there were times in Earth's history, and I'm talking 200–300 million years ago, when carbon dioxide levels were a lot higher. And the Earth was much, much hotter, and we had completely different species living here. But in the past several 100,000 years, we've stayed at 280 parts per million until the Industrial Revolution, when things started picking up. And in fact, here is that same graph, but stretched back to several 100,000 years. And you can see, so on the y-axis, on the vertical axis, we're looking at carbon dioxide parts per million, and here's time. And you can see there are fluctuations. You know, many things contribute to carbon, including volcanic activity and so on. So there's lots of fluctuations, but we don't rise above 280 parts per million. And then we start going up. We're above it at 1950, and we keep going up. So again, carbon dioxide levels do vary naturally. Carbon dioxide is produced every time you breathe, and every time a bird breathes, and every time any animal breathes. It's produced naturally. Volcanoes emit it. They're a big source of carbon dioxide. So why do we believe that carbon dioxide released by humans is causing the increase in temperature? And again, it's correlation, but extremely strong correlation. If you look at this NOAA graph, you can see that the red line is atmospheric CO2. And since the Industrial Revolution, we have a slow increase. And then right at the middle of the 20th century, a steep climb. And that correlates extremely well with CO2 emissions from human sources, from agricultural burning, from coal burning and oil and natural gas burning, and also cement production, which is a CO2 emitter, but I'm not sure why. But you can see accompanying this rise, this accelerating rise in atmospheric carbon dioxide, we see a rise in human-caused emissions, and they line up pretty neatly. Where does carbon dioxide come from? What do humans do to make CO2? What are the anthropogenic sources of CO2? Well, combustion of fossil fuels in a variety of uses is by far the biggest culprit. It accounts for about 80% of all the human added CO2 in the atmosphere. So electricity production, land use changes that involve burning, transportation, that number is going up, are all big factors. And cement manufacture, again, is responsible for about 5% of the CO2 in the atmosphere. So construction activities that involve making cement do increase CO2, but not nearly as much as fossil fuel burning. So again, why do we think that, again, emissions related to human exclusive activities pair really well in terms of increase, the slope of those graphs with the rapid increase in atmospheric CO2, but can we look at that a little more closely? Well, here is the detailed look at CO2 that again has been measured directly in the atmosphere from the top of the Mauna Loa volcano since 1958. And you can see that there are very, very strong seasonal ups and downs. Those seasonal ups and downs, the red line, that's corresponding to winter and to summer, because in the summertime, when plants are growing and doing photosynthesis, they are incorporating, they're taking in carbon dioxide and they're using it to build their tissues. So they're sequestering carbon. So in the summer, carbon dioxide levels go down a little bit and then they rise again in the winter. And so we see those short-term fluctuations, but those short-term fluctuations don't do anything to account for the black line. That's the upward trend of overall parts per million. And so this overall parts per million, this isn't coming from annual carbon flux. This is coming from carbon that has been stored for long periods of time, as wood, as coal, as oil. And also we'll see from the soil as well. And quickly, there are other greenhouse gases as well. Have they increased as much as carbon dioxide? And the answer is Yes, they have. So carbon dioxide is the red line. Methane has increased even more and is now suddenly increasing quite a bit as the Arctic warms, and so have nitrous oxides. Although we have done a better job of nitrous oxide abatement than we have of carbon dioxide or methane. So how do we know, though, that it's human emissions? Couldn't changes in solar activity be changing the Earth's climate? Could factors other than human activity be doing it? Well, we do see little blips when there are major volcanic eruptions. When Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines erupted, we saw little blips and we can measure them. But let's look at the sun. We can measure the incoming solar radiation. And so since 1880, we can measure the incoming solar radiation. That's this yellow line. And we can also measure the temperature. That's the red line. And you can see that solar irradiation, it fluctuates again, that the dotted line are annual and 11-year fluctuations. The sun goes through several different cycles, so it fluctuates a bit, but here's the 11-year average, and it increased slightly here in 1950. But if anything, lately, it's been slightly decreasing. So solar irradiation, the major driver of heating the Earth, hasn't really increased and has been decreasing in the past 2 decades, yet the Earth's temperature is going up. Furthermore, if the sun was responsible for warming the atmosphere, the sun is way outside of our atmosphere, so it would warm every layer of the atmosphere. But if you take temperature measurements of the atmosphere right now, the lower part is very, very warm, but the outer atmosphere is much, much cooler. That really is a sign that it's in that lower atmosphere where the greenhouse gases are radiating heat back. That's where the heat is. The upper atmosphere isn't very warm. The sun isn't warming that. So again, more evidence that this isn't coming from the sun. So last graph bit, let's talk about climate models because they're important. And at the end of today, when we talk about the Audubon research, they're going to rely heavily on models. You probably heard of the 1.5 degrees Celsius warming forecast and the 2 degrees Celsius warming forecast and so on. How do we get those warming forecasts? How do we get those scenarios? Well, those come from climate models. And for climate models, and these are made by atmospheric scientists and massive amounts of computational power. Climate models are made by breaking the Earth's atmosphere up into teeny tiny grid points, and then at every grid point, basically reducing all of the atmospheric processes back down to their physics. So it's basically reducing those processes. 1 degree of heat makes 1 milliliter of water evaporate at X speed, reducing every part of the weather system to equations, and then putting in all the variables for each grid on the graph. At this location, how much CO2 is there? What's the incoming temperature? And so on, and just making a giant interconnected model that models every single atmospheric equation as best we can, and then feeding it in new data and saying, well, if the CO2 at this position is X, then what's the output? And that's how models work. And one of the things that models have told us, that's the super simplified way that models work. One of the things they've told us is that if you build a model of climate, if you replicate all of basically the physics that's going on, and you put in all of the known climate drivers, if you look at only the natural climate drivers, the things that humans don't control, that's basically volcanoes and solar warming, you get temperatures that should look like the blue line. If you add in anthropogenic temperature drivers like fossil fuel burning, you get the red line. up here. And if you look at the actual measurements, you get the black line, meaning that we can't account for the atmospheric activity and the atmospheric warming with just natural sources alone. And we particularly can't account for the rapid increase unless we include anthropogenic sources. The models are pretty good. A paper that just came out this year did a pretty cool thing, which is that it looked at 17 climate models of increasing sophistication that have been developed starting in 1970 and then went up to about 2007. And now we have even more sophisticated models because we have so much higher computational power, better computers. But they looked at the models that we've been using for a long time. And now looking back in time, they tested them against known data. So they looked at models that, in 1970 were predicting what future temperatures in 2020 would be. They looked at models that in 2000 were predicting what temperatures in 2020 would be. And they looked at all of the models, and what they found was all of the models did a pretty good job of predicting the temperatures. And we know what those temperatures were, so we can go back and test them. And so the range of the models was in this sort of turquoise area here. The average of the models, though, was the black line, and the actual temperature observations were the red line. So even old models from 1970 were pretty good, and the new models are even more complex. And in fact, these are the most current set of future climate models that are going to be incorporated into the next IPCC report. And they take into account better and better atmospheric physics and understandings, better and better computing power, and also many, many more scenarios about what might happen. What if we all switch to wind power? What if poorer countries do this and more wealthy countries do that? And they've given us a whole variety of potential warming scenarios. So starting from 2000 and going to the year 2100. And so there are some models that show temperature declining slightly. Those probably won't happen. But there are some really extreme models. And it's these models, or several of them, that are incorporated into the Audubon report. So finally, models can't prove that humans are involved because science doesn't prove anything. Science gives you the best evidence, which, if we discover something new, can actually, change our ideas. But climate models show that the changes we've observed in the climate so far are consistent with and can really only be explained by human causes. And there's huge scientific consensus. Over 97% or more of actively publishing climate scientists agree that climate warming trends over the next century are extremely likely due to human activities. Climate scientists don't always agree about the nuts and bolts of which physics model we want to employ to measure precipitation somewhere, but they all agree. And so do the national science, the national science agencies of all of these nations. Okay, so that's the end of the graph part. Yay! Now let's talk a little bit about why climate outcomes are still difficult to predict. And that's because of feedbacks, because the climate system is really interactive. All aspects of the climate interact with other aspects of the climate. There's this sort of constant change in the climate system, and it's hard to model all of those things. So the biggest feedback to our Earth climate system is something called albedo. And albedo is just how much of the incoming sunlight the Earth reflects. And we know that ice and snow reflect about 85% of that incoming sun right back out into the atmosphere. It's a very reflective surface. Anybody who's ever gone skiing and sunburned the underside of your nose knows that. Vegetation and the ocean, on the other hand, absorb most of the incoming sunlight. And this has always been going on. And for as long as the relative ice pack stays the same size, we can pretty easily model how much of the Earth is covered in ice, and we know how much of the Earth is going to radiate back, 85% of the incoming light. But as the climate warms, that ice melts. And as that ice melts, we get less of this highly reflective surface, and that's land ice and sea ice. We get less of this highly reflective surface and more of this deeply absorptive process. And so that sets up a positive feedback loop. The warmer it gets, the more ice melts. The lower the albedo is, the warmer it gets. So that's one feedback. And here's the picture that says what I just said without looking at that picture. The more ice and snow that melt, the more incoming solar radiation is absorbed, not reflected. So warming begets warming as it reduces albedo. Another thing that happens when sea ice and glacier ice melt, that's really pretty terrifying, is there's the potential for altered ocean circulation. And this just made the news a couple of weeks ago. So if we look at the Earth, there are sort of two types of currents. There are the surface currents, and the surface currents in the oceans are driven by the wind, mostly the wind and the spin of the Earth. But there are also deep currents in the ocean, and these deep currents are driven by density. And the density of ocean water depends on temperature and salinity, how much salt is in it. And so we call the process that drives those deep ocean currents thermohaline circulation, thermo for heat, haline for salt. And here's a map of the sort of interconnectivity of those surface and deep ocean currents, and it makes up what's called the global conveyor belt. And what happens in this global conveyor belt is that let's start here, right in the Arctic. And in the Arctic, that warm surface water, those warm surface currents, and here's the biggie, the Gulf Stream. These warm surface currents get to the Arctic and they get colder. As they get to the Arctic, they're getting colder and colder. And as they get colder and colder, and the cold temperatures evaporate water off into sea ice, so water's being sucked away and frozen, the water also gets saltier. And it gets colder and saltier and eventually sinks really, really deep right here east of Greenland. So that water then flows back down the side of South America to Antarctica. And then in Antarctica, there are no continents around Antarctica so the currents can circulate freely. So some move out toward the Pacific and some move out this way, some move in to the Indian Ocean. Those currents keep going. The ones that begin moving north as they move further and further north to the Indian Ocean, those surface currents, as they get closer to the equator, the water warms and warms and warms, they rise, and we have upwelling. Upwelling is when surface winds push the surface water away, and as they push the surface water away, the lower, colder water rises. So that colder, lower water rises near the equator, and then it moves again on the surface as warmer water until that cycle starts again. And this entire cycle takes roughly 1,000 years. And this is the deep, there are many side currents that go along, but these are the deep ocean movings that really move nutrients around the globe. And every place that we have upwelling, and we have upwelling, all along the coast here, that's a place where there's lots of nutrients. So this is a way that the global ocean circulates nutrients and circulates heat across the globe. Now, as the planet warms and the Arctic ice sheets melt, what happens is that the water gets warmer because the sun is warming it. And as the ice melts, that's fresh water in the land ice and the ice sheets, that makes it less salty. And so there's this idea that if enough fresh water and warm water flows into the Arctic Ocean, that could potentially disrupt this global conveyor flow in the Arctic, because the water won't get salty and cold enough for it to make that deep plunge. And so if that happens, if the conveyor in the Arctic turns off, that Gulf Stream, that warm North Atlantic current will kind of just turn around a little bit south of the UK. That means much colder temperatures in the North Atlantic and much warmer temperatures everywhere else, because we won't get that deep circulation. And what's so troubling is that just recently, just February of this year, evidence, more and more evidence has been gathered that Atlantic overturn, that overturn in the Arctic is at its weakest in the last 1,000 years. Okay. More feedbacks as sea ice melts and the oceans warm is that there's going to be more erosion. Reduced sea ice increases storm damage to the coast, and probably a lot of you have seen these pictures of Shishmaref, Alaska, and some of the other coastal Alaska towns that were built close to the shore, and they're eroding fast and just collapsing. So it's bad for people. But as there's coastal erosion in the Arctic,
please join us up here right now.
Okay. As
Dr. Denton, I'm sorry, I don't know if you're muted.
okay, how did I get muted?
There you are.
Okay, sorry.
Just a quick reminder to everyone, if you could please make sure that you stay muted during the presentation.
Sorry, I didn't realize that I was muted. Okay, so the sea ice melts, as the ocean warms, we get a lot more erosion, and erosion exposes peat. And in the Arctic, we have peatlands, and peatlands are just, you know, it's deep, old, decaying carbon from that's buried and so cold that there's very little bacterial and fungal and microorganism degradation. Peatlands are the most carbon-dense ecosystems on Earth. And as decreased sea ice allows these peatlands to erode, this peat is exposed, and it actually off-gasses carbon and methane. And in addition to off-gassing the carbon and methane, these peatlands are burning. This summer, there were almost constant peat fires, particularly in the Russian Arctic. We have a lot of peatlands in Canada and Alaska, but the Russian Arctic has the world's largest number of peatlands. And maybe you read this over the summer. These peatlands burned all summer, and these fires burn and burn and burn, and then they kind of go out when it gets cold and there's snow, but still burn underneath the snow. And then when the snow melts off in the summer, they continue to burn again. And as fires burn this ancient peat that's been storing carbon for thousands and thousands of years, huge amounts are being released as CO2 and methane. Permafrost covers 24% of the Arctic, everything here in purple. And as the climate warms, permafrost is melting. And you can see permafrost is truly frozen soil. It's soil that stays frozen all year long. And as permafrost, and when the soil is frozen, all of the microorganisms in that soil are basically frozen as well. They can't do their activity. They can't break down carbon dioxide. Once this permafrost melts, all the bacteria are able to do their basic metabolic processes and melt that release that stored carbon back to the atmosphere. And so melting permafrost is hugely problematic. huge amounts of Arctic, Canadian, Alaskan, Russian infrastructure is built on permafrost, but it also radically changes ecosystems. And much of the boreal forest is built on continuous permafrost or intermittent permafrost. And as permafrost thaws, it leads to the entire ecosystem built on permafrost. The trees topple, and drainage alters. Places that used to never drain and be lakes, when the permafrost melts, then those areas can drain. And the boreal forest, which is on permafrost, is the home to 325 North American birds that rely on the boreal forest for continuous nesting or migratory stopover habitat. So again, permafrost melting is bad for birds. And in addition, permafrost melting is again releasing huge amounts of CO2 and methane. And again, methane is a much stronger, methane in the atmosphere is a much stronger re-emitter of heat. And our methane levels are increasing dramatically due to permafrost thaw. Okay, so that's the end of the really scary stuff, but I do encourage you, I only touched on a teeny bit of climate change science, and there are some really excellent, reliable sources to get more information. NASA has an excellent site called climate.nasa.gov. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has an excellent site, which is www.climate.gov. And California has an excellent site. California does climate assessments routinely, and their site has information directly applicable to California. And I encourage you to check it out for more science. And I couldn't resist one mammal picture of the Arctic. So this is the only mammal you'll see. We'll go back to birds, but let's talk a little bit about biology. Quick, are there any immediate questions about science? The science of climate change before I go on?
Yeah, I have one, Amy.
Sure.
So in your little slide about peat fires, I know that you mentioned that they're like a really big contribution about carbon emissions. I also know that they're one of the highest emissions of mercury into the atmosphere. But is there any benefit to peat fires in the ecosystem? Like when we have fires here in the grasslands and they're used for seed regeneration and stuff like that, is there any benefit like that for peat fires? Or is it solely a negative system that's happening there with them?
I don't entirely know. I would think on average, it is much more of a negative because the peat isn't just sitting around. Like the peat is, the only thing living in the peat are possibly microorganisms. I don't think that it's the same effect you get like when there are forest fires, but I don't know. There may be some benefits. I only know what really about the big things like the plants, and I can't see any, but there could be.
Cool, thanks.
I just don't know. Okay, I'm not quite sure when I started, but I'm gonna accelerate. Sorry, I get really excited by graphs and I tend to go on. So let's talk about the biology. And again, we don't have time to talk about all of the impacts of climate change on birds. So I'm going to skip over sort of the obvious ones like physical heat stress and disease, because mosquitoes can get to places where they haven't been before, bringing things like West Nile and so on. Those are fairly obvious. And I'm going to focus on the bird effects that have drawn the most attention from scientists and certainly from Audubon. And that has to do with a larger process called phenology. And phenology is just the timing of life cycle events. And we see it all around us in biology. The rut in deer and moose, the migration of birds, the hibernation of bears, flowering of plants, and the falling of leaves. These are regularly timed life cycle events in biology. And humans have been observing phenology for a long time. There are records where humans record the annual migrations of storks and turtle doves that date back to the Bible, that date back to Aristotle. The Japanese, there has been a continuous written record of Japanese cherry trees blooming for 1,200 years. Humans like to record some of these biological events, so we have good data from them. In fact, one of the most important papers of probably the past decade was a phenology paper that used data recorded by Thoreau back in the 1850s when he was at Walden, and also by Aldo Leopold back in the 1930s in Wisconsin. And both of these guys just recorded when they first noticed certain species of flowers. And then in 2013, modern botanists used Thoreau's observations of flower opening from the 1850s and Leopold's observations of flowers opening from the 30s and 40s, and they made their own measurements. And so they were able to put Thoreau in the blue, Leopold in the blue, their modern measurements in the red. And then there was a guy up in Boston who did some measurements right around the turn of the century. And they were able to show, using this older data, that yes, indeed, plants were opening 3 days earlier per 1 degree increase in Massachusetts, and 4 days earlier per 1 degree Celsius increase in Wisconsin, just by using this older data. And so this kind of early citizen science is super important, and it's going to be really important. It is very important to Audubon, but it's really important in climate change biology. So the most important long-term climate impacts on plants and all animals and birds, of course, are these phenology changes, these timing changes, because when a bird migrates, it can become disconnected from when plants bloom if they eat plants, or when plants fruit, or when the insects that they eat are at the appropriate stage. So the biggest threat to birds really are climate-imposed timing changes. And particularly to migratory birds. And again, I just have to keep getting in my Arctic bird pictures. So here's the champion migrator, the tern. And I've been lucky enough to go to ternaries in Iceland, which are mass breeding grounds of terns. And I've seen many people get pet. But let's look at some recent research. And most recent research about migration looks at something called trophic mismatch. And the word trophic has to do with feeding. And so trophic mismatch is when there's a lack of synchrony, a decoupling of the phenology of, say, the birds and the phenology of their resources. So when birds migrate based on their genetics, on signals that they measure, but those are separate from the signals that the plant uses to bloom or to set fruit. And those are separate from the signals that an insect uses to go through various pupal stages. And so birds and the plants and the bugs and the mammals that they eat all evolve together under this really fairly stable carbon dioxide regime for millions of years. And now we're having this rapid decoupling. That's trophic mismatch, the mistiming of consumers and their resources. And so this paper here just did the first initial survey looking through the literature to see if they could find trophic mismatch. And one of the first trophic mismatch papers that was published, and again, not long ago, these are all fairly recent, looked at nitrogen concentration in Arctic geese. And they found that geese really couldn't adjust their breeding time to compensate for different the plants that they eat would bloom as soon as the snow melted. And as the snow melted earlier, the geese were not able to adjust when they laid their eggs. And so in years when the snow melted the earliest, gosling body mass was much reduced. So we're beginning, some of the earliest trophic mismatch papers were looking at individual species like these geese. This is a caribou paper, but I'm mentioning it because it discovered something that's even more important with trophic mismatch, which is that, we can't think of, many birds depend on plants at some point for their food, whether they eat them directly or whether they eat things that eat the plants. And we can't think of plants as one unified group, what was happening in the Arctic is that with climate change, some species could take advantage of the warm temperatures and they would bloom super early. Some species of plants base their flowering completely on daylight hours, which doesn't change with climate change. And so what was happening is that there was becoming this longer and longer period between the early blooming plants and the rest of the plants. And there were actually summer deserts where no plants were blooming. And so again, different species of food source, different species of plant react to climate really differently. There have been a couple of papers on something called green wave surfing that discuss how when birds do long migrations, they synchronize their migrations with seasonal changes in vegetation, and especially in the spring, they'll follow these green waves. Another really new paper just published in 2020 looked at satellite data to estimate, to get good measurements of greening. And then they used, and this is how citizen science has become so important in climate change. They used eBird observations as well as observations from many other citizen groups. They looked at 230 North American migratory bird species in 7 dietary guilds, so carnivores and grain eaters and nectar eaters and omnivores. And they looked at these just based on observations where birds were seen. They looked at them from a long period of 12 years. Sorry, it's a wordy slide. But what they found was that there was a really strong synchronization between birds that ate plants, grain, or both. Less strong though for carnivores and certain insectivores. And so they were finding that for birds, and this makes sense, obviously, birds that eat grains and plants were suffering, beginning to suffer serious trophic mismatch. There was the potential for them to get to where they wanted to be in their migration, and they could miss their peak food supply. There's another really excellent new paper doing citizen science. Actually, not citizen science, excuse me, just using amazing computational science. They looked at weather stations. They looked at 13 million weather scans from 143 stations over a 24-year period. And they developed really high-level computer algorithms that could detect bird migrations on the radar scans, that could detect the signal of a bird versus a rainstorm. And so they were able to simultaneously track, going back 24 years, when birds were migrating at night, and they used 143 stations all over the country. And again, what they found was at the continental level, they were finding that the average peak migration timing was advancing in the spring with rising temperature, and that spring migration was shifting forward just about 2 days each decade, much higher, much faster at higher latitudes, and that those migration timing changes were different depending on how far birds migrated. So again, these are small little changes, but what we're seeing is that climate change is causing a noticeable, so far only gradual, shift in bird migration, one of the most important things. And then finally, before we get to the Audubon stuff at the end, here's another really new paper that looked at the little auk, the dovekie, which spends most of its time in the Arctic. It does migrate a little bit south from Franz Josef Land in the high Russian Arctic. But what they discovered was that with the loss of Arctic sea ice, that more and more of these birds were just deciding, I'm not going to migrate into the Atlantic, I'm going to cross the Arctic. And here's the little auk, here's the lovely little bird that they looked at. What they discovered was that the loss of Arctic sea ice between the Atlantic and the Pacific changed a lot. It was causing some birds to completely change their migration pattern, shifting from North Atlantic migration to going across the Arctic and going into the Pacific, or changing from Pacific migration going across the Arctic and into the Atlantic. Or for some birds, it made sense in terms of calories to just stay in the Arctic year round. So some of these great, these classic migratory flyways that we're used to thinking, a lot of those start in the Arctic, and the Arctic is changing fastest. And so Arctic changes can really, result in major changes in the flyways. For the little auks, they were birds that had normally come through the Pacific are now going through the Atlantic. And as we get more and more temperature change, and again, the Arctic is changing faster, and so many birds go through the Arctic, we're going to see more and more major changes in migration. And so that brings me to the very last bit, which is Audubon. And I hope that some of you have been to the Audubon, the national website, where they have a whole, clickable section on climate. And one of the things they just published was this massive work about species on the brink because of climate. And it's based on two recently published 2020 very extensive papers that you can download right from the site if you want to look at the original papers. But again, what they did was they looked at 604 bird species. And again, they did this kind of massive compiling science where they looked at just hundreds of thousands of observations, and they looked at feeding data and climate data, and they wrote these massive computer algorithms to just make sense of when certain birds were seen where at what temperature. And what they discovered, and they sort of ranked birds in terms of vulnerability. And what they discovered, the sort of big take-home message of this paper, was that 64% of North American species are vulnerable. And they defined vulnerable as in danger of losing, of having their range shrink and not being able to make up that range in other places. And 64% of birds are vulnerable. Some birds, like Arctic species, are all highly vulnerable. Boreal forest birds are all highly vulnerable. And that makes sense. Again, these are birds that need the high north. But Western forest species, which we have in California, water birds, another really vulnerable group. And I encourage you to look through this information. I don't want to go through all of the charts, but they're super interesting. What they broke down North American bird vulnerability based on different climate change scenarios. Remember when I was talking about models, we can feed a climate model. We can say, what happens if temperatures only go up 1.5 degrees? What happens if they go up 3 degrees? What's going to happen to all of these other parameters? And when they did that, they found that there's a huge difference between a 1.5 degree increase in terms of critically vulnerable birds versus neutral birds, and a 3 degree change. Again, this is a graph from the Audubon paper looking at birds that are under conservation watches now. So birds right now that are of low conservation concern. That's a good thing. These birds are of low conservation concern, but most of them are vulnerable to climate. So under a climate warming scenario, many of these birds that we've never even had to worry about are going to move into that the conservation zone. And the birds that are already vulnerable are extremely vulnerable under climate warning scenarios. If you look by state, by geography, this probably won't surprise you. This is a graph showing you combined climate threats. And under a 1.5 degree warming scenario, the Southeast, the Southwest, the Northwest have a couple of combined threats. But under a 3 degree warming scenario, the Southwest, where California is, and the Northeast, birds will face multiple threats. And again, here's another sort of breakdown from the Audubon paper, and I encourage you to read it. It breaks down the types of threats: sea level rise, extreme spring heat, and again, by a 1.5 degree warming or 3 degree warmings. And what it's basically showing you is that 97% of species could be affected by multiple threats, particularly under a 3-degree warming scenario, but even under a 1.5-degree warming scenario, and we've already warmed close to that, extreme spring heat and heavy rain are really the only serious threats to birds under the current scenario. But if we warm up more, a lot of other threats will begin to add on. These are the species in particular that Audubon is monitoring. And I don't know if I'll have time to show you, but you can use the Audubon site to plot the vulnerability of your favorite species. Limiting warming to 1.5 degrees would result in most species only experiencing a single threat. And so I'm going to skip. Here's another sort of difficult graph to go through, but it breaks down birds of a variety of habitats and then shows you how many species in each habitat are effective. That's this whole line here. So, and how many are affected by differing numbers of threats. So you can see that for breeding birds, coastal birds and subtropical birds are affected by the most number of threats. And again, if we warm less, majority of birds aren't facing multiple threats. So what are the threats? Well, the threats to birds, there are threats that birds have always been experiencing, like urbanization. And urbanization means more cement and more trees and less places for birds to eat and breed. And again, the tan is under a 1.5 warming scenario, and the red is under a 3-degree warming scenario. Look at that difference. Birds that are already facing difficulties from urbanization will face much more difficulty if the climate warms extremely too. And I meant to say that, and California birds are among the birds that are most in danger. Similarly, cropland expansion. Cropland, agricultural expansion is the one thing that's probably going to go down as climate change gets worse and worse because there'll be so much drought. But again, birds that are already impacted by loss of habitat from agriculture will be even more impacted by climate. And again, California birds are expected to do that. Right now, currently, California birds are not terribly in danger. There's some populations around San Francisco Bay, but most sea level rise impacts are going to be first to birds on the southeast coast. But again, bird lovers love all birds. And then, of course, there are the intermittent threats from climate. And before we even talk about climate, birds have always faced weird anomalous threats. Most of you probably remember this fall, this kind of late summer and fall, thousands and thousands of birds were dying in the Southwest, in New Mexico. And finally, by January, they had done enough necropsies that they decided that they were kind of falling out of the sky, and it was discovered that there was probably sort of a perfect storm of a couple of really early surprising snowstorms to birds that were finishing their migration. So they were already food depleted, so they were weak. And then they had a couple of storms, and most of the birds they found were just massively emaciated. So it was just a combination of bad weather at the end of the migration, and we have massive die-offs. So birds are already susceptible to these intermittent threats, but extreme spring heat under climate warming scenarios will affect birds in all states. And again, I'm getting these pictures right from the Audubon document, so I encourage you to take a look at it. Fire weather will impact birds pretty much everywhere but the southeast, and the fire weather risk goes up massively from the 1.5 warming scenario to the 3-degree warming scenario. And of course, California birds are under threat of fire. All southwestern birds are under threat of spring droughts. And again, the chance of droughts just goes up enormously if we increase an additional 1.5 degrees. So you can kind of see where Audubon is leading. Other threats to birds won't affect California birds as much, like unusual heavy rainfall in certain places, or false springs, which are when it gets warm and plants start to bloom, and then there's a late freeze and all the flowers die, and so nothing sets seed. And that's a really bad situation, not terribly common in California, but it is a big threat to birds in other states. And then finally, the Audubon site breaks down its threat general paper. You can download state by state specific threats. And so the specific threats to birds in California due to climate change, these are the 6 major threats affecting California birds, not many affected by sea level rise. Extreme spring heat, fire are the biggies for California birds, extreme spring heat in particular. And in California, the average temperatures during the warmest months, under that 3-degree general increase in global temperature scenario, the warmest temperatures are expected to increase by close to 10 degrees by the end of the century. And precipitation is actually going to increase slightly statewide, but moisture will decrease because of increased evaporation from the hot temperatures. And under that 3-degree scenario, you can see where we are, birds will be facing multiple threats from fire, from intense spring heat, and so on. In California, the most vulnerable birds are the birds of the forest and the driest lands right here, particularly the forest birds in both summer and winter. 146 out of 307 California species would lose range under 3-degree warming. But we could cut that number dramatically in a 1-degree warming. And Audubon rates the species that are most threatened in California as these. And again, you can find all this information now quickly. Sorry, I'm going so long. I just wanted to show you on the Audubon National site, there is a great tool that you can use to look at the bird you might be interested in. And so if you go to the Audubon main site, under their climate page, you can get to this 2/3 of North American birds are at increasing risk of extinction from temperature rise. And then I'm on Zoom, so I have to go to it a different way. Why couldn't I share that?
We can see it.
Now you can see it. Okay, sorry, I couldn't see it. Okay, so this is the Audubon link, and you can look for your favorite species under this bar here, search bird species at risk. If you can put in a species that you like, put in one that I miss here in New York. And you get Audubon's page, and you can click, oops, sorry. You can click right here on climate vulnerability, and it'll show you under a 3-degree warming scenario, how much white-crowned sparrow range is lost. In the summer, you can click that over to winter. You can check out what happens under a 1.5-degree warming scenario, how much range is lost. The red is the range that's lost. So you can clicked out. Okay. You can search by zip code. So you can search any bird species like this. You can search what's happening geographically instead of by species. So I just put in a Ventura County zip code. Vulnerable birds in Ventura County. So under a
Okay, my earphone's dead, so I'm going to have to talk to computer. There are 38 species of highly vulnerable, 52. You can click on the species so you can see. I'm not going to go through it, but this Audubon tool really lets you explore all the birds that are vulnerable in your own area. And so I just wanted to end on a happy note. So we're there. The last part of Audubon's 389 species at risk paper talks about what we need to do. And there are two things that we have to do. We have to do something called climate adaptation. And that is preparing for the impacts of climate change. So preparing our infrastructure, our coasts, our watersheds, our grasslands, of the things that humans need and the things that the birds need. We can prepare better. We can defend against fires. We can defend against water loss. We can make our infrastructure work in a climate changed world. And we also need to do climate mitigation. And that's something that Audubon speaks about quite a bit. We need to reduce or prevent the causes of climate change. And the best way for us to do that is to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. We need to reduce greenhouse gases 45% below the 2010 levels by 2030 and reach net zero by 2050 to limit warming to that 1.5 degrees Celsius, at which place there are the threats to birds and everything else is much diminished. And so Audubon has a lot of ways that you can help with climate adaptation for birds, many ways that you can get involved in climate mitigation efforts. It has some opportunities for citizen science. And you know, climate change is frightening and it affects everything on Earth, but there is still time to limit the worst effects of it, the worst impacts for people, for plants, and for birds if we act quickly. And so sorry I went on for quite a while, but thank you. And are there any questions?
We do have one question from the chat box, and it's from Tom. And
Sure.
He asked, since we talked about climate with the loss of ice in the poles and in Greenland that now absorbs sun rather than reflect it back into space, sun warmth, sorry. He asked, are we at a point of no return? Meaning, do we need a super volcano or something of the likes to start cooling the climate again?
That's a good question. We are probably past, I mean, the Arctic is losing ice so dramatically that it's actually hard to model, because the Arctic, one of the places I talked about a situation in which all of those old models really predicted warming temperatures really well, but models from 10 years ago failed universally to predict ice melt. Ice is melting much faster than we thought. We are, in terms of ice melt, that's going to happen. And I don't know if they can stop the complete, I mean, I don't think in our lifetimes we're going to have the complete loss of the Greenland ice sheet and the Antarctic ice sheet. But that's going to melt a lot more than I said. And one of the things I forgot to mention in this entire talk is that carbon dioxide has a residence time in the atmosphere of 300 to 1,000 years. So that's why this is so important. That's why it's different from water vapor. Water vapor is here and it's gone tomorrow. Carbon dioxide that we put into the atmosphere 10 years ago is going to stick around. So that's why, that's why even though this year there was less fossil fuel burned, because of COVID, nobody drove anywhere and flew anywhere. But we're still, carbon dioxide we put in 20 years ago is accumulating. And so I think they're having a hard time really modeling what's going to happen completely with the ice, because it has defied the models and gone much faster. So I don't know. I like the idea of a super volcano, or, like one of those superhero sun shields or something. Technology is going to save us, so I hope.
I don't see any more questions in the chat, just lots of thank yous.
Thank you. Well, thank you, everybody. Sorry, I can talk. It's when you're on Zoom, I really wanted to do this live, because when I talk live, I'm not such a steamroller. It's hard not to be on Zoom.
It was great.
Thank you.
Yes, feel free, anybody, you don't have to type your question into the chat. Feel free to unmute yourselves and verbally ask your question to Amy, or if you have any comments or thoughts or experiences, please share them with us. We like this to be a discussion time post-presentation.
I'm having Bluetooth issues, sorry. Is there an interest? I can like compile a reference list of all the papers that I looked at, including links to the Audubon stuff, and send it to you or Cynthia, if you wanted to post it. If people are interested in that, I could certainly do that.
Yeah, Amy, that would be
slides, or
Yeah, that would be fantastic. So what we normally do is on the website, there's an archive of all previous presentations. And there's obviously this recording, but then there's a PDF format as well. So we can include all of those references and website lists on that PDF format as well for people to access here and in perpetuity.
Okay, I can put together all those papers. They're all from like 2019 and to the present, and the Audubon links if people want.
Yeah, fantastic.
So yeah, I'm happy to do that.
Well, if nobody has any questions, I think this is a first time we're all stunned with the amount of information that we were given. I guess we can end it here if really nobody has any questions.
Hey,
I know
Kat.
I asked mine, but.
Hey, Kat, I've got a quick question or maybe
Yeah.
a comment. This is Amanda. I'm actually zooming in from a little further north of you guys, but I just wanted to say thank you, because I think there's been a real kind of fallout with people feeling more and more apathetic about, like, we've passed 400 ppm in the atmosphere and nothing can be done and we're just all doomed. And so I really liked Amy's comment at the end about how it's about limiting the impacts. It's about trying to reduce the suffering and how we can't just throw in the towel. There was a section of time where everyone was going, oh, climate change isn't real. And everyone's like, okay, it's real, but it's too late. And you're like, no, we have work to do, everybody. And so I really like that ending, and that National Audubon website looks awesome. I'm going to check it out. So thanks again.
It's great. I know on the national site, they have a whole things we're doing climate. And if you click on that, you get to this. It's a really interesting tool. And again, you can learn, species by species vulnerability stuff. It's kind of fun and somewhat depressing to play with.
Yeah. Depressing, but yes, I still like your comment though about we still have to try.
Well,
we can't throw in the towel.
I'm encouraged because it's been slow, but you hear people talking about climate. You didn't, in the 2016 election, it was not a priority. It was the economy and healthcare, and it's up there now. Which
that's
we're
great.
really slow to the game, but it's up there.
Yep, that's so great. Well, thank you so much for all your work and your presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with Amanda. I think what people are starting to realize now about climate change is that it's not just this environmental aspect that everybody, brings to the forefront with their ideas about it. It's like, it involves healthcare, it involves communities, it involves, a development and things like that. When we have global water shortages, food deserts and things like that, this is, all impacts of, climate change that has been happening in the past and it will continue to happen in the future. And like, Amy said, like, there is this gloom and doom aspect of it, but there are these pockets of really amazing, hopeful, new scientific advances and people and organizations coming together and, brainstorming ways that we can implement ideas and, things now, and thinking about if those don't work, what's going to happen in the future and what can we do in the future to make, these sustainable changes. And I think that's a really amazing aspect that, climate change is kind of this all-encompassing thing. It's not just about this one singular focus of like, we're all these environmental whack jobs, you know, screaming at the top of our lungs. It's really something that impacts everybody globally, whether we want to believe it or not.
Well, and I mean, it took us, you know, until rivers were burning to, you know, start doing, you know, to have a Clean Water Act, you know, and you know, we seem to always be kind of late to action, but capable of pulling out some pretty miraculous feats, and I am counting on science and technology somewhat to help us here, but it's definitely possible to mitigate. You know, just thinking about it, you know, won't help doing something. So, and Audubon has, I think, a really good attitude about, you know, educating and sort of focusing on save what we can. You know, that's something everybody can do.
Yeah, I completely agree. Well, I want to thank you, Amy, so much for your presentation tonight. And I get some sleep. It's late on the East Coast, but thank you so much. And for everybody, yes, this is being recorded and it'll be up on the website later this week, and you can access it and Amy's reference list of all those wonderful resources that she presented us.
Should I send that to you?
Yep, go ahead and send it right to me. All right. Thank you guys and have a wonderful night.
Good night, everybody.